A barefoot boy slipped through the gate and, with nothing but a crooked grin and a clumsy dance, drew a laugh from a girl who had not smiled since the accident. That single sound forced a billionaire to choose between his empire and his heart, and when a leaking photograph turned mercy into scandal, the whole city held its breath to see which would win, image or truth. The city took its breath at dusk, a long, salty exhale that mixed with the heat from the streets, and the towers of glass and steel held the last blue of the sky like a promise. Wet asphalt caught neon signs that flashed English words and local slang in the same flicker, while market stalls hummed with voices selling fish, yams, and stories, and an old highlife song threaded through the alleys, soft and steady. Behind a high hedge, a mansion sat like a golden memory, marble steps and polished pillars glowing warm against the coming night, its gardens kept neat and quiet as if silence were a kind of luxury, chairs were placed just so, fountains cleaned until water turned into a gentle mirror, and inside the halls the lights were set to give everything a careful, expensive glow that smelled of polish and order, but the hush there was not peace. It was a shaped absence, the kind of quiet that reminds you of what used to be. Richard Lawson moved through that silence with the careful steps of a man who had learned to hide storms behind his face. His suits fitted like armor, his jaw held firm, and his hands kept score of contracts and losses, but no ledger could hold the hollow the accident left. The nights when he woke and listened for a laugh that did not come, he had fixed roads, bought hospitals, and paid for the best doctors. Yet something deeper would not be bought back, a small, bright sound that used to live in the house and seemed now to belong to another life. In a quiet corner of the garden, wrapped in a blanket the color of warm sand, Amanda sat in her wheelchair with eyes like questions. She was small and careful, lips that forgot to speak some days, and toes that sometimes twitched as if they remembered a dance the rest of her body had not yet learned. She watched the world in careful bites, tracing the shapes of birds and clouds with the same patience she tried to use when she practiced lifting a finger, a hand, a hope. Outside the gate, a boy called Kola hesitated at the edge of the estate, a small shape against the hedge, barefoot, shirt torn at one shoulder, knees shaped by scrapes and stories, eyes bright and quick, a grin that arrived before he decided whether the world would accept him. He had lived under bridges and behind stalls, and dance was the language he had learned to survive, to speak to strangers and loosen their pockets or their hearts. The market below the mansion roared with life as dusk drew its color across the city, women bargaining with high, laughing voices, bus park boys selling secrets with a wink, drums and radios mixing old proverbs with new slang, and words fly in that music, promises, warnings, prayers, all of them stitched into the soft pattern of evening. The garden looked small and private from the road, a patch of green with a tiny fountain that made a sound like a cupped hand. A wheelchair sat by the hedge as if it belonged to the place, and the space felt like a stage waiting for something to begin. The nanny did her rounds with an easy rhythm, checking blanket corners, smoothing a stray curl, humming a lullaby that still kept the memory of the girl's mother in the house. She watched the garden like someone guarding a small, fragile thing, balancing duty to the family with a fierce care that kept her from speaking too loudly about what she feared might be lost. Kola slipped through a gap in the hedge with the furtive grace of someone used to moving unseen. Then he stood where the grass met stone and decided to speak with his feet. He danced with silly faces and exaggerated steps, arms chopping the air like a clown, a slow theatrical stumble here and a pretended fall there, movements that made his small body say things his voice could not. And every spin and fake trip carried the hunger that lived in his belly and the fierce joy that lived in his bones. At first Amanda only blinked, the sound of the boy a tiny interruption to the house's careful quiet, but then a small giggle slipped out, like a light finding a crack. Kola saw it and widened his eyes, pretended to lose balance, and when Amanda laughed properly, a full, honest sound that shook her chest and brightened her face, the noise traveled through marble halls and over hedges and landed like an answer where it had not been heard for months. Richard froze on the balcony above, a man ready to shout, to call guards, to restore order, and for a breath fury rose like a tide, the thought of a stranger stepping inside his walls sharpening him into anger, but the sound changed the shape of that anger, and he found himself holding it back because the laugh belonged to his daughter and he could not punish the hand that gave it back. He kept watching, hidden behind a pillar, as Amanda clapped and looked alive for the first time in a long time, as Kola danced harder, spilling into silly impressions and wild spins that drew out more sounds from the girl, each one erasing a small piece of the house's long sorrow. That first day became a private miracle that slipped into the family like warm sun. Kola came back the next afternoon and the next, always slipping through the same hole and always leaving before the street lamps threw long shadows. The routine became a quiet ritual, for a clock arrival, 2 hours of play, a soft goodbye, and those small visits threaded a new rhythm into the mansion, gentle as a heartbeat. The nanny watched with a secret smile and a careful eye, giving the boy a plate and waiting until the gate had closed to breathe fully. She found herself rearranging the afternoon chores so the little hours were kept safe, and in the kitchen the staff whispered in lower, softer tones about the miracle growing on the lawn. Each day the girl found a little more courage, a finger lifted, then a wrist, then the brave attempt to match Kola's tiny jump with a hopeful twitch of a foot. She copied his silly faces with concentration and then released a giggle that grew into a laugh. That sounded like the house learning to breathe again. Kola ate when given food, the movement slow and grateful, as if each bite were a tiny redemption. He never asked for money and never took more than the plate offered, and in return he gave Amanda something the doctors could not, play that asked nothing of her but to notice joy again. The city beyond the hedge hummed on, unaware of the small revolution of sound occurring inside the Lawson Gardens, but the contrast of worlds was clear in every detail. Richard's polished shoes on marble, the boy's cracked heels on dew-soaked grass, the mansion's warm lamplight against the market-strung bulbs, and each image pulled at the story like two hands trying to hold the same thing. Richard's face, which had learned the hard lines of command, softened in private, and at night he found himself replaying that laugh like a prayer. He began to understand that no expertise or bank account could reach the place inside his child that had curled away after the crash, and that perhaps the medicine he had bought was only a language for the body while the boy had found a language for the heart. In the hush that followed each visit, Richard whispered a thank you into the garden as if the hedge might carry his gratitude. Kola rolled on the grass and watched the sky, tired and alive, and Amanda put her palm out and learned to trust that someone might place a hand there, steady and warm. This small, fragile turning planted two seeds, in Richard, an ache of shame and a root of hope, in Kola, a brave joy that nudged the boy toward a family he had not asked to belong to, and as the evening folded into night the city kept singing its market songs, the mansion kept its golden silence, and the garden held a new sound, the sound of life beginning to return. Kola arrived at the garden like clockwork, slipping through the hedge at 4 and leaving before the street lamps leaned over the road. Those 2 hours became a quiet ritual, a small ceremony that threaded light into Amanda's afternoons and into the house's long silence. He would bow with a silly face, spread his arms wide like a small showman, and Amanda would clap, at first softly, then louder as trust spread through her chest. The routine kept everyone steady, the nanny watched the gate, the staff hushed footsteps, and the mansion found a new heartbeat in a boy who had learned to speak with movement. Every day the winds were small and clear, a finger lifted, a wrist turned, a brave reach for a toy that had been out of reach for months. Amanda learned to count her own progress with quiet pride. 1 clap became 2, 1 foot twitch became a tiny push against the footrest, and the family watched with breath held. Each small victory was noted in whispers at the dining table and in the nurse's log, a slow list of proofs that joy could coax the body to remember its old music. The tiny moments grew like pearls strung on the same thread of 2 hours a day. From his balcony above the garden, Richard watched more than he let on, timing Kola's steps like a man who once timed shipments and contracts. Suspicion softened into a careful hope as he mapped the boy's routine and measured Amanda's smiles. He kept to the shadows at first, arms folded against a chest that had learned to guard grief, counting claps and watching for the small flecks of muscle that meant real effort. Sometimes he found his throat tight, at other times numb, and he learned to hide the way his eyes tracked their afternoons. The balcony became his secret observatory, a place between control and surrender. Behind the high gate the neighborhood hummed with talk, and whispers moved faster than any car. Neighbors and staff traded opinions about the unexpected guest, some calling Kola brave and others calling him a risk to the Lawson name. Market women passed hot takes over steaming pots while guards rolled their eyes, split between loyalty and fear. Rumors smelled like rain in the street. They stuck to tongues and spread to social corners where people stitched gossip into new meaning. The mansion's quiet began to crack under the weight of curiosity, and small doubts grew like cracks in plaster, hard to ignore once seen. One morning a single photograph slipped into feeds and phones, Cola mid-spin on the garden grass, Amanda clapping behind him, a headline that twisted kindness into spectacle. The image moved fast, hands forwarding, voices rising, and suddenly the private magic felt public and exposed. Phones buzzed on kitchen counters and in waiting rooms, staff whispered the word tabloid as if the house might need a bandage. The picture made the story physical, a proof that others could hold and point at, turning tenderness into a risk to manage rather than a miracle to protect. The calls came next, sharp and cold, boardroom voices telling Richard to distance himself, investors warning that reputation could not be gambled on sentiment. There were polite threats and careful counsel about discreet solutions and clinical fixes. The message was the same: remove the variable, secure the asset, avoid headlines. Richard felt the tightening, authority demanding loyalty to image, and he had to choose between the safety of a balance sheet and the messy, human process that was healing his daughter. Pressure was a presence in the house now, like a second shadow that waited while Cola danced. Inside the mansion the staff found themselves split along invisible lines, some protected Amanda and tended the boys' plate with caring hands, while others feared the scandal and watched the gate with suspicion. Quiet alliances formed, a kitchen hand saving a bit of stew for Cola, a gardener making sure the grass stayed soft, a maid covering the boys' little snares when guests arrived. Secrets were kept in the lull between chores, small acts of rebellion in a household trained to smooth every ripple. The staff's loyalties became the soft scaffolding that held the afternoon routine steady. A polished consultant arrived one afternoon with a discreet smile and an expensive folder, offering advanced therapy and a fast, private program for a fee that smelled like a transaction. The pitch was precise: remove emotional exposure, put Amanda under clinical care, promise measurable gains and no headlines. It was the kind of solution Richard understood by training: buy the problem away, close the file. The offer tempted him because it solved public risk quickly, but it also threatened to erase the human thread Soda had built between a boy and a girl, a thread no scanner could measure. Then the call from the past came to Cola, a former friend from the bus park, a figure from the streets with a hard tone, offering quick money and reminding him of the rules of survival. The friend's voice spoke of shortcuts and debts that could not wait, of the old ways that kept boys fed and safe at night. Cola stood at the hedge, torn between the fragile life taking root in the mansion and the quick survival the streets promised. The choice weighed on him like a season of hunger and longing, and the question of loyalty became a test of who he would be. A loose paper folder slipped across Richard's desk one evening and opened into a truth that did not fit comfortably in his pocket: a missed maintenance order, a delayed inspection, a small bribe buried in paperwork. The hints of negligence that might have led to the crash were faint but real, and guilt rose like a tide in his chest. He had built an empire on deals and smooth answers, and now the ledger showed a human cost he had not fully seen. The discovery started the slow work of moral reckoning. How much would he confess, and what would he lose by telling the truth? One routine therapy visit stalled and Amanda's fragile confidence hiccuped. She tried to lift her hand but the muscles pulled back as if startled by their own memory. Her breath caught. The doctor's face was careful as he advised measured progress and warned against building hopes on emotion alone. Amanda looked to Cola and Richard for steadiness, needing them to anchor the fragile spark she had found. The household held its breath as the small setback tested all the new routines and asked whether joy alone could sustain physical change. In the market people read signs in the recovery like they read weather. A prayer circle said it was fate, a woman pressed a tiny talisman into Cola's hand as if blessing were a currency, and street preachers called it a sign of something larger at work. These small tokens of belief wove the city's spiritual thread into the private life of the mansion, giving the household a cultural coat of many colors. Cola held the talisman like a promise. Amanda touched it through a fence and felt like something old had been invited to stay. The mansion's fountain, once loud and sure, sat cracked and silenced like a paused memory, and its repair became a small parable for the family's work. Fixing the fountain would not rush healing but would be a steady, visible act of care. Conversations by the water's edge turned to plans: hire a mason, order new tiles, reopen the flow. The fountain's slow coming back to life mirrored the careful steps needed in the house, the idea that some repairs are messy and require patient hands rather than quick money. The nanny adjusted schedules with quiet skill, creating soft hours where Kola could perform safely and the boy could leave before curiosity grew into a problem. She handled visits like a choreographer, blocking and timing to protect fragile progress. Her work was small and fierce. She shifted the maid's rounds, whispered excuses to visitors, and taught Amanda to expect the boy at the same time each day. Her steady plans became the background structure that allowed the family to grow tender without collapsing under public pressure. A doctor who had seen both statistics and heart spoke with Richard in private, offering sober counsel. Emotion could be a powerful medicine but needed to be paired with measured therapy. Do not let headlines decide treatment. The doctor's voice was a calm counterpoint to the public noise, asking Richard to balance hope with plan, joy with repetition. His advice hung in the room like a map, practical and human, urging the family to guard Amanda's agency and to let the boy's role be part of a careful recovery plan. An envelope arrived with an investor's formal ultimatum inside: remove the boy or face financial consequences. The message was clean and cold, a contract between image and profit pressed into paper. It landed like a physical weight on Richard's desk, demanding a decision that would test family, legacy, and conscience. The ultimatum showed how power and money move quickly to protect themselves, and the family faced their sharpest question yet: choose safety of empire, or choose the messy work of love that might cost everything. A glossy photograph landed online like a hot stone dropped into still water, and the ripples were loud enough to wake the whole city. The picture showed Kola mid-spin on the Lawson lawn, Amanda clapping behind him, the shot angled to look like a scandal. The headline called it exploitation and the image moved from phones to newsstands in an hour. Market women paused in the middle of bargaining to point and murmur, bus drivers shouted the gossip at traffic lights, and neighbors who had once smiled politely now leaned on fences and hushed their words. Inside the mansion, a housemaid's phone buzzed at the sink, a guard's screen lit up in the gate booth, and the nanny swallowed a tea that had gone cold. What had been a private miracle was suddenly a public story, and the story did not know the gentle names they used for each other. Richard's phone became a drum of alarms. Calls arrived in a hard, careful rhythm from lawyers and board members who spoke of brand risk and investo confidence as if people were only numbers on a chart. Distance, one voice said. Discreet clinical care, another advised. The polished counselors offered clean solutions: move Amanda into a private program, issue a statement, assure stakeholders. Their language was smooth and practiced, but it carried the same message: remove the boy, restore the image. Richard sat at his desk with the photograph open on a lit tablet and felt something he had not felt in years: the raw, human weight of a choice that could not be balanced with spreadsheets. The board's urgency pushed like a tide, and for the first time the ledger could not tell him what to do. Kola saw the same photograph through a neighbor's cracked phone screen at the bus park and felt the old, cold fear settle in his stomach. In the streets, pictures were justice and punishment, and this one looked like betrayal. He packed a tiny, worn bundle, a shirt, a small radio, a coin or two, and stood with his hand on the hedge as if he could lift himself out of a life he had learned to survive in. The garden felt suddenly dangerous, the chairs he had once used as props felt like traps. He teetered between staying where his laughter had been welcomed and running back to the life that had carved him hard. The hedge held him like a question, he almost ran. Old loyalties rose to meet the new storm. A former friend, a boy hardened by nights without shelter, read the gossip and answered with rage. He and a few others met Kola in a narrow alley that smelled of cooking oil and rust. There were words filled with hurt and accusation, the kind that make a man's jaw harden. "You left us," the friend said. "You sold us for a plate." Kola tried to explain, but the language of the streets is blunt and quick. Explanations do not always fit where anger waits. The confrontation made clear the danger of moving between two worlds, one that offered belonging and one that offered survival. Kola stood smaller than he felt, and the alley's shadows tested his new courage. Meanwhile, an NGO with good intentions stepped forward with a neat solution wrapped in a tidy proposal, promising advanced therapy at a private center away from the mansion. They spoke of progress, of privacy, of professionals who could give Amanda the measurable gains that pleased boards and headlines alike. The offer sounded like a promise, safety from scandal and a path to improvement without interference. But the program's plan left out the small, human moments, the afternoons when a barefoot boy made a girl laugh and when that laughter pushed a finger to move. To Amanda, it felt like losing a friend. To Cola, the plan read like erasure. The choice became less about health and more about the right to keep the people who mattered close. Inside the house, Amanda felt the walls tighten around the things she had started to love. She learned both the weight of adult decisions and the fierce smallness of a child who only wanted someone to stay. She pressed her palms to the blanket and said, "Please don't send him," with a voice that trembled but held true. Her plea was simple and pure and hit Richard like a stone. He wanted to answer with a practical plan, to say yes to therapy that could be scheduled and measured, but the laughter that had returned to his daughter did not fit into neat boxes. Her small powerlessness before the grown world exposed how the systems that protect reputations often ignore the quiet things that heal hearts. The pressure pushed Richard into his papers, and the work desk that had always held contracts now revealed a different kind of record, a memo stamped and unsigned, a delayed maintenance order, an email that suggested corners had been cut. The details were small at first, a missed check, a quiet payment, but together they formed the shape of something that might have allowed the accident to happen. Guilt rose like a slow tide, bringing with it a moral weight Richard could no longer keep at the edge. The choice before him sharpened: bury the documents to save the company and his name, or let truth loose and risk everything for a chance at real repair. Outside the mansion, the city grew louder in its own way. Cameras fed on each new move, a handful of angry voices swelled into a chorus demanding answers, and prayer circles gathered in market corners to say grace for the child and call for justice for any wrongs. In the garden, Amanda sat small and steady as a world argued beyond the hedge, and the contrast between the camera frenzy and her quiet face felt like a test of what mattered. The city's roar was harsh, but the garden's hush kept something safe for a moment longer, holding the fragile truth like a breath before the next step. The morning smelled of diesel and wet pavement as press vans lined the courthouse steps and reporters tuned their cameras with hungry hands. Richard Lawson received the summons like a call he had always feared, a formal paper that turned a private ache into public law, and he dressed with a slow, careful ritual, tie knotted, breath measured, a quick prayer. While the city outside moved like a restless sea and Amanda waited at the mansion with Cola in the garden, the choice humming in the air. Between saving an empire's image and speaking a hard truth that might break it. He walked through ancestral corridors where framed faces watched with quiet judgment, security parting the crowd and flashbulbs popping like distant thunder, each step toward the podium pulling him back to his wife's voice and the silence she left, and the memory made his chest a tight drum. This walk was a moral heartbeat, a slow countdown to a decision that would mark whether money or honesty would shape his legacy. In the hearing room, boardroom voices sat like judges in suits, lawyers folding neat lines about brand risk and miscommunication while investors hardened their faces and headlines assembled themselves before words were fully spoken. The air tasting of metal, paper, and centuries of family choices, and Richard heard the polite, rehearsed counsel that asked him to protect profits even if it betrayed the fragile joy his daughter had found. Then, when the room finally stilled, he stepped forward and in a voice that shook and then steadied he named the truth. An ignored report, a delayed inspection, the whisper of a bribe that cut safety short, dates and documents spoken plainly. Cameras leaned in and the newsroom world convulsed, not at spectacle but at the quiet courage of confession, as a powerful man traded his polished image for an honest repair and opened a wound that might also heal what had been hidden. Outside the courthouse the city split into a roar and a hush, anger rising like a tide against corruption while a quieter current praised the rare act of truth. Protesters gathered, market women whispered into their scarves, social feeds flashed with both fury and praise, neighbors debated at stoops, and the mansion's garden became a small island of calm where Amanda and Cola watched a world tilt and where the double voice of the city shaped the stakes of what would come next. Drawn by that tidal change, a hopeful crowd pulled Cola into view and he stepped forward with nothing but the language he knew, his body, and offered a raw, brave dance, a single defiant bow, a motion that cut through scandal and spoke of belonging. the gang watched from the edges, surprised by his courage, and the city paused between cheer and scorn as a barefoot boy claimed his place and changed how people saw him. The public drama spilled into the alleys where old debts followed new headlines. Kola met his former friends in a narrow corridor smelling of oil and frying dough, and words sharpened into fists as the streets tested his loyalty. He refused to trade the fragile family he had found for quick survival, taking blows and standing like a drum on cold concrete, forcing the gang's leader to choose between violence and retreat. And in that raw scuffle the undercurrent of the city had to reckon with. The meaning of courage. Back in the quiet green of the garden Amanda heard the distant roar and, with a depth of will that surprised even her nurses, decided to try walking again. She set her hands on the wheelchair arms, breathed slow and deep, and pushed, each small step a careful rebellion against fear as muscles relearned trust. Cameras slowed time to near silence for her trembling legs, and faces around her, Richard's clenched hope, Cola's stunned grin, the nanny's wet eyes, held as she took several steady steps toward them, the hush breaking into applause that felt like a brief city reprieve. A high camera pulled up and left a single, lasting frame, 3 figures on the green stage of the lawn, the father, the daughter upright and moving, and the barefoot boy who had danced them toward one another, light slanted warm orange over deep blue dusk, skin and cloth and grass readable, and honest in a shot that looked like a modern parable and that would travel across screens as a symbol that compassion can recalibrate power. The garden, once a private refuge, became a public icon of redemption. In the hours after Richard's confession and Amanda's breakthrough, the city shook, markets and neighborhoods buzzed, some business partners withdrew, and legal investigations began. Public sympathy grew, community leaders called for safer streets, and local groups proposed youth programs and dance mentorship inspired by Kola. Richard faced fines and losses, but he also gained a new kind of respect. The household's bond became a public story that changed how the city talked about responsibility, showing that truth can be costly but can also begin real healing, and the climax closed with both losses and clear steps toward repair, justice, and new priorities. Richard stood before cameras in a room of stern faces, the weight of hearings pressing like a tide, and when he spoke it was plain and steady, not for theater but for repair. He said the company had failed, named steps they would take, and apologized in a voice that carried both regret and resolve, while legal teams arranged reparations and safety audits and community leaders were invited into meetings where words became plans, not excuses. Workers in reflective vests began to appear at dangerous crossings the very next week, crews repainting lanes, fixing potholes, and installing lights where shadows had once swallowed people. Richard sat in community halls with elders and market women, rolled out blueprints, and listened as if their stories mattered more than closing arguments, learning that reputation must be earned through action and not polished press. Kola received an offer that could have changed him overnight, a room, regular meals, and a place at a proper school, but he hesitated, holding tight to a piece of the streets that had taught him survival. The family did not force him, they negotiated gently, turned an old study into a classroom where he learned letters and numbers alongside proverbs and city history, and he practiced his dances with a new purpose, choosing a life that kept both his friendships at the bus park and a steady roof above his head. Amanda kept going to therapy with a new courage, combining the doctor's routines with the boys' daily laughter, and she began to appear in public with small, respectful celebrations of progress. A short walk at a neighborhood market, a careful step up a charity terrace, filmed with dignity to show a city that disability was not a secret to hide but a life to support. Ramps and classroom aids followed, and people who once whispered now offered hands and plans to make spaces open and real. Inside the mansion the nanny changed too, moving from silence to leadership, gathering caregivers for support circles, sharing tips and protecting Amanda's privacy while insisting the household become warmer and more honest. Dinners once served by clock now filled with stories from the market, staff who had feared scandal learned to become part of the repair, and the house itself softened from a guarded museum into a home where small acts of care mattered as much as grand statements. Community centers rose in old warehouses and market halls, funded by a shaken but committed businessman who now saw investment as repair. Programs taught dance, trades, and sports, and Kola led a small troupe that went into schools and festivals teaching resilience through movement, turning his street steps into a craft that gave young people new ways to belong and kept them away from gangs. Richard reached out to old partners, admitting mistakes and proposing new ethics. Some turned away, unwilling to change, while others signed on to oversight and public reporting, and an advisory board formed with market elders, an NGO representative, and a youth leader to guide future projects so that profit would be joined to civic responsibility. Kola made choices that kept his voice central. He accepted schooling and a small stipend he controlled. He could return to the bus park on weekends to check on friends, and he insisted on teaching dance to boys who missed a father's hand. His acceptance was not a rescue but a negotiation that honored where he came from and where he wanted to go, and the city watched a boy shape his future rather than having it written for him. At dusk the city looked different. Repaired streets glinted under new lamps, community centers hummed with music, and a twilight panorama showed deep blue sky pierced by warm lights, where Kola in patched shoes walked beside Amanda as she steadied herself on a short cane and laughed, a sound that had once been a private miracle now shared with neighbors. Richard stood nearby, older in the face but lighter in spirit, and the final view pulled back to show market women smiling while children practiced dances, a fountain running again, and the slow, steady work of mending that began not with a press release but with a confession and a bowed head. The moral settled simple and clear: when wealth meets humility and systems meet community, true repair follows, and the city's identity began to shift, pride mixed with responsibility, courage matched with kindness, and a new story took hold where justice and love moved together to remake lives.